Breaking news: China and Russia reject reimposed UN sanctions on Iran as illegal and unacceptable. In a dramatic turn in global diplomacy, China and Russia have issued a joint statement rejecting the reimposition of United Nations sanctions on Iran. The two major powers declared that the renewed restrictions are illegal and unacceptable, vowing neither to recognize nor comply with the measures. This joint declaration underscores deepening divisions in the international community over how to address Iran's nuclear program and regional policies, while highlighting Beijing and Moscow's growing partnership in challenging Western-led global governance. The joint statement. The statement, released simultaneously in Beijing and Moscow, condemned the move to restore sanctions against Tehran. China and Russia firmly opposed the unilateral attempts to reimpose United Nations sanctions on Iran, the communiqué said. These measures have no legal foundation and violate the spirit of international diplomacy. We will not recognize or enforce such restrictions. The two governments stressed that any attempt to isolate Iran would fail, adding that they would continue to engage with Tehran in trade, energy cooperation, and defense ties. Background: the sanctions debate. The controversy centers around the United Nations Security Council's efforts to revive sanctions against Iran that were lifted under the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal. The agreement, signed by Iran, the United States, the European Union, China, Russia, and others, limited Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. However, the U.S. withdrawal from the deal in 2018 under then-President Donald Trump reignited tensions, leading to a complex international dispute. While the U.S. and some European allies have pushed for restoring sanctions, China and Russia have consistently opposed such measures, arguing that Washington undermined the deal by pulling out unilaterally. Iran's position. Tehran quickly welcomed the joint statement from China and Russia, calling it a historic stand against unilateralism. Iranian officials praised both countries for defending international law and resisting what they described as American pressure tactics. Iran's foreign ministry issued a statement saying, "The illegal reimposition of sanctions is an injustice against the Iranian people and a violation of the nuclear agreement. We welcome the strong support from Beijing and Moscow, which strengthens the case for multilateralism and diplomacy." The U.S. reaction. The United States, however, dismissed the joint statement, insisting that sanctions are necessary to curb what it sees as Iran's destabilizing activities in the region. American officials accused both China and Russia of enabling Iran's defiance of international norms. The world cannot ignore Iran's continued nuclear escalation and regional aggression, a U.S. State Department spokesperson said. Sanctions are a vital tool to pressure Iran into compliance. Any country that refuses to enforce these measures is undermining global security. European divide. Europe remains divided on the issue. While countries such as France, Germany, and the UK have expressed concern over Iran's nuclear advancements, they have not openly aligned with Washington's hardline stance. Instead, European governments are calling for renewed diplomacy and a return to negotiations, fearing that escalating tensions could push the Middle East closer to conflict. China and Russia's strategic calculus. For China and Russia, rejecting the sanctions is more than a gesture of solidarity with Iran, it is a broader challenge to U.S. influence in global affairs. Both countries have deepened ties with Tehran in recent years. China has signed a 25-year cooperation agreement with Iran, expanding investment in energy, infrastructure, and technology. Russia has supplied Iran with advanced military systems and coordinated with Tehran in regional conflicts such as Syria. By declaring the sanctions illegal, Beijing and Moscow are positioning themselves as protectors of international law while simultaneously undermining U.S. efforts to isolate Iran. Geopolitical implications. This joint stance could reshape regional dynamics. With the support of China and Russia, Iran may feel emboldened to resist Western pressure and accelerate its nuclear and defense programs. This could, in turn, heighten tensions with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other regional rivals who view Iran's rise as a direct threat. Moreover, the move may accelerate the trend of global polarization, with China and Russia forming a bloc of resistance against Western-dominated institutions. Analysts warn that this could weaken the credibility of the United Nations, especially if permanent Security Council members openly defy its resolutions. Potential consequences for global security. experts fear that the rejection of sanctions could lead to a dangerous stalemate. If Iran continues expanding its nuclear program without restrictions, Israel and the United States may feel compelled to consider military options. Meanwhile, China and Russia's backing of Iran complicates any potential international consensus, raising the risk of confrontation. At the same time, the sanctions dispute threatens to destabilize global energy markets. Iran, which holds some of the world's largest oil and gas reserves, has long sought to expand exports despite restrictions. With Chinese and Russian support, Tehran could bypass Western sanctions and increase energy sales, potentially altering global supply dynamics. Iran's domestic reaction. Inside Iran, the joint statement has been hailed as a diplomatic victory. State media portrayed it as proof that U.S. efforts to isolate Tehran have failed. Citizens interviewed by local broadcasters expressed hope that closer ties with Beijing and Moscow would bring economic relief after years of sanctions-driven hardship. However, critics inside Iran caution that over-reliance on China and Russia could limit the country's independence, warning that economic dependency on these powers may create new vulnerabilities. The road ahead. As the debate intensifies, several possible outcomes emerge. 1. Continued stalemate. Sanctions remain contested, with Iran relying on China and Russia for survival while tensions with the West persist. 2. Renewed diplomacy. International pressure eventually forces all parties back to the negotiating table, potentially reviving some version of the JCPOA. 3. Escalation. Failure to reach consensus leads to further nuclear advancement by Iran and the possibility of military confrontation. 4. Shift in global order. China and Russia's defiance strengthens their global standing while weakening Western-led institutions. Conclusion. The joint declaration by China and Russia rejecting the reimposed sanctions on Iran is a bold geopolitical statement. It not only challenges the legitimacy of the United Nations' actions but also signals a reconfiguration of global alliances. For Iran, it represents a lifeline of support; for the West, a diplomatic and strategic setback. As tensions rise, the world watches closely to see whether this dispute will lead to renewed negotiations, deeper polarization, or even conflict. What is clear is that the balance of power in international diplomacy is shifting, with China and Russia standing firmly against Western attempts to dictate the course of action on Iran.